Now we're going to be thinking of both users and microposts as what are known as resources, which is essentially just something that you can create, edit, and delete through a web interface, and indeed just through the HTTP protocol, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol generally. So in order to generate a resource and all of the code needed to manipulate a resource, we can use what's called the Rails generate command. And if you give it the argument scaffold, then it will generate a whole bunch of code for you. In this case, we're going to start with the user data model and learn how to manipulate that, and then later on we'll move on to microposts. And we want to use the singular version of the model. In this case, it's the user data model. Let's put it up for reference here. Now we can actually put the data model at the command line, and all kinds of great things happen. Like Rails will generate the necessary code to manipulate the model with those attributes. In this case, we're going to say that there's a name that's a string, so name : string, and email : string. And note that I've omitted the ID. That gets added automatically. And here Rails has created a whole bunch of files and directories as needed. And you can take a look at them. There are a lot of them, though. So don't worry in this entire lesson about the details, because we're just getting a high-level overview at this point. If you try to understand all the details, it will just be overwhelming. The whole rest of the tutorial is dedicated to understanding all the details that we'll see at a high level in this lesson. One of the things that you get as part of this Rails generate scaffold is a file that will allow us to create the proper database to manipulate objects that have IDs, names, and emails. In other words, we can manipulate and store users in a database. As I mentioned in the last lesson, the database is an SQLite database. So the way to prepare the database is to use a Ruby build function, a Ruby build method called rake. This is Ruby make. And Rails uses rake for a bunch of different things, including changing the database structure. In this case, we're going to do rake db : migrate. And having made those changes, it's a good idea, since we're using version control, to commit those changes. So let's do git status, just to see what the status of our files are. Okay, so we can get a hint about something that's going on. This is a hint that something has been automatically modified by our scaffold command. This config/routes.rb already existed in our repository, and it was modified. And we haven't modified it with a text editor, so it must have been modified by that Rails generate scaffold command. And then we've got a bunch of untracked files. These are the files that were actually created by the Rails generate scaffold command. So let's add them. Git add dot git commit dash m, and then we're going to say created a user's resource. Typically, when you talk about user or talk about resources, you'll use the plural. Rails has a lot of conventions on singular and plural, and you should pretty much be able to pick them up by osmosis throughout this tutorial. So git status. Okay, good. All right, now that we've made those changes, let's take a look at what they actually did for us by running a server. So I'm going to open up a new tab for this. The server takes up the terminal window it's running in, and I'm still going to be typing commands here, so I want to create a new tab and run the server there. cd Rails projects, demo app, Rails server. And you can actually just type S. It's a shortcut for server if you want. And here we go. Let's take a look at what this got us. Remember, it's localhost 3000. That's disappointing, isn't it? It's exactly the same as our first app. It's just the welcome aboard, you're writing Ruby on Rails page. Well, this is because by default, Rails just serves this particular file, which we'll actually see in the next lesson. If you type localhost : 3000 /, this is what gets served, and this is called the root URL, and so the root URL, the root path, is just this thing. In order to see our users resource, we need to type a URL that has users in it somehow. And we're going to start with the URL to list all the users, which is just /users. Now, unsurprisingly, there aren't any users right now. So let's take a suggestion here and click on New User. Now, at this stage, I want you to take a look at the URL. In fact, in this entire lesson, we're going to be interacting with this application through the URL. So probably the most important single thing to keep track of is which URL we're at any given moment. And in this case, we're at /user/new. Because this localhost 3000 part is always part of the URL, I'm just going to omit it. And conceptually, it doesn't really matter. It's just whatever the root domain is. But this part is going to be very important throughout the rest of the tutorial. So this page is /user/new, and it's a form for creating a new user. So let's create a new user. Oops, let's create myself and spell my name right. And I'm going to say I'm Michael at example.com. Okay, I submitted the form, and now I'm at what's called the user show page, which in this case is /users/1. So what does this 1 mean in this context? Well, remember that all users have an ID. In this case, we've just created a user with an ID equal to 1. And so if you go to the URL /users/ the number of their ID, what it does is show information for that user. Also notice that there's a message here, user was successfully created. This is what's known as a flash message, and it's really useful because oftentimes in web applications you want to have some message that appears once and then disappears on subsequent requests. And in fact, if you refresh this, take a look at it, it disappears. So that's the flash. We'll be talking about that more in future lessons as well. So far we've gone to /users, we've gone to /users/new, /users/1. Now let's go to this page, /users/1/edit. So this is the URL to edit an existing user. In this case, the user is user number 1. And let's change the name to the canonical misspelling of my name with an E. Michael Hartle with an E. And there we go. We've got another flash message. We've got the updated misspelled name. And we have the same show URL we had before, /user/1. So if you click on back, we'll go to /users, and now you can see that we're listing all the users in the application. In this case, there's only 1. So there's only one more thing we can do. We've created a user, we've shown the user, we've edited the user. The one thing left is to destroy the user. So let's see if we can destroy this user. I am sure. And there we go. No more users. So before moving on, let's create a couple users, which we'll be using later on in this lesson. Let's create a user called foobar, and say Foo's email address is foo@bar.com. And let's create another user called bazquux, and let's see, be baz at quux. I think quux is .net. There we go. And let's put a third user in. Let's restore me back from the dead. Example.com. By the way, example.com is actually reserved for this use. It's awesome. Check it out. You think that I'm just using it because it sounds good, but no, it's like actually reserved for this use. So anyway, I've always thought that's awesome. Okay, there we go. So we've got our 3 users. Now at this point, we're going to examine what we just did from 2 complementary perspectives. So first, we're going to look at a single request, namely this request that we're doing here, a request to get the page of all users, and really figure out what's going on in that particular situation. And then we're also going to examine the structure of the application overall in terms of all of these URLs that we've been focusing on. Let's take a look at a diagram of what's going on here. This is the model view controller pattern for web applications. And this will give us a sense of how this process of getting a URL such as /users actually works. So there are a bunch of steps here, and we're going to look at some actual source code here corresponding to these steps in just a second. So let's get a quick overview though. When a web browser, in this case Firefox, hits the URL /users, what happens is it gets routed by the Rails router. Remember, we saw that the routes.rb file had actually been modified by the scaffold, so that's a hint that something is going on. So that that URL gets routed to what's called the index action. Now, index has been used as the default page in web pages, just not even web applications, but just static sites, since the beginning of the web. I think right from the beginning of the World Wide Web. So /users gets routed to the index action in one of the controllers in our application. In fact, it's the only controller with any real content in this case, and that's the user's controller, corresponding to the user's resource. And then what happens is that controller talks to what's called the model, which then pulls information out of the database, in this case the corresponding to the 3 users we just created, returns those users as a list to the controller, actually as a Ruby array, and then it passes a variable to what's called the view, which is essentially a web page, but it's a web page with possibly dynamic content. And then that web page gets rendered as pure HTML and then gets passed back to the browser. And what browsers do in life is turn HTML into rendered web pages. Now, I'm actually not sure if the HTML goes right from the view to the browser or if it goes to the controller, but it doesn't really matter. From a conceptual point of view, I really like to think of this controller as being the central hub through which all information passes in a Rails application. So let's take a look at some of the code that corresponds to this model view controller pattern. We'll actually start with the router because that's the first step.